Good afternoon. Hello. Hi. My name is Wendy Richardson from the Michigan Military Technical and Historical Society. And it's great to see everybody here. And I just want to remind you all of we do have our upcoming events on the table. And so we'd like to see you guys out for some additional lectures in the future. On March 19th to the 20th, we are having our used books sale and White Elephant. So if you have any donations for us, we'd be thrilled. But then we want you to come on back and buy some from us. And then April 3rd at 2 p.m., we do have the Japanese balloon bombs, which should be a really interesting lecture. And then on April 23rd, we have Fashion Through the Decades. If you're interested in that program, we do have tickets available at the counter. And then finally, on May 15th, we have the Military Dodge presentation. We are bringing in David Doyle from out of town. So we're starting to expand our lecture series. I am proud to announce today's lecture. We have Elizabeth Clemens, and she's an audiovisual archivist at the Walter P. Reuther Library, Archives of Labor and Urban Affairs at Wayne State University. She's also the author of Images of America, The Works Progress Administration of Detroit, and like so many archivists, she's going to be behind the camera today. She's going to be back there by her computer, but it should be a wonderful presentation. Elizabeth?
Well, thank you for having me. Like she mentioned, I'm an audiovisual archivist, so what that means is that I help researchers find materials to support whatever their interests are that are either moving images or still images. And one of the reasons why I got into the profession for this is because I believe that we connect with history on a very different level when we see it rather than when we're reading it off of a page. Oftentimes you can have a more direct and emotional response. So that's why I'm so excited to share these with you today. The presentation is going to be mostly visual. Most of the images are from the collections that I work with, primarily the Detroit News Photo Negative collection. Most of them were scanned off of original 5x10 glass plate negatives, which is why they're so beautiful. Basically, thank you for having me, and I hope you enjoy them. So, anyways, let's get moving along. I think all of us are pretty familiar with the First World War, the basics. You have it start in 1914 with the assassination of the Archduke. Europe pretty much splits up into two teams. You have the Allies, which is the British Empire and the Russian Empire, and then France, and you have the Central Powers, who are the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany, and Bulgaria. As the war goes on, they have people joining and leaving each side, with the Ottomans coming on to the Central Powers. Then Italy leaves and comes to the Allies. The Allies also get Japan and the United States. So we join in 1917. And this is one of the things about the First World War that always kind of blows my mind, because we were really only in it officially for 18 months, and yet it had such a huge impact in the way our country was going to go from that point on. But let's bring it back to Detroit. When the war began, Detroit was in the middle of a huge shift in population, physical growth, and industry. You could say it was having a bit of an identity crisis. Between 1900 and 1920, Detroit had transformed from a mid-sized manufacturing center to the nation's fourth largest city, featuring a total industrial landscape. And of course, all this growth was due to the exploding auto industry. Dozens and dozens of auto companies existed side by side in the city, and the advent of the assembly line created a need for new workers. Among economic migrants and immigrants, Detroit was a popular destination because we had a reputation for being friendly enough, with nice single-dwelling neighborhoods, and most important, good-paying jobs that required little to no skill and did not necessarily demand that you be fluent in English. Just so you can get an idea of how crazy this population growth is, you can see that it was doubling every 10 years, and this was causing more than a few growing pains. This period was also the beginning of the Great Migration, which brought large numbers of African Americans from the South up to the great industrial cities in the North. And this is the time when our African American communities really began to grow and flourish. But of course, the majority of the people coming to the city were immigrants from Europe and the Near East. At the start of the war, there were at least 32 different immigrant groups living in the city. I might have missed some, and I apologize if I've missed your people. While the groups often lived in similar or adjacent areas of town, language and cultural barriers tended to silo the communities. At the beginning of the conflict, as a city, Detroit was not affected much by the war, other than it was contracted to produce neutral machinery, such as ambulances and transport ships for the Allies. Her ethnic communities were another story, because Detroit, with all of its different representations, was a microcosm of the European theater. As conditions deteriorate overseas, Detroit's ethnic communities look homeward, desperate to help. Detroit had a large Belgian community, one of the largest in the world outside of Europe, and its members wanted to do something to help their countrymen who were suffering through the war and the local famine that had ensued. Many gathered clothing and food to ship back through the Belgian Relief Fund. Others left the U.S. to fight in the Belgian army. In August of 1915, Father Sion of Our Lady of the Sorrows Church in Eastern Flanders left for Eastern Flanders and returned with 116 Belgian war orphans. The children were placed with family members already established in Detroit and were taken in by foster families. The orphans really opened people's eyes and served as living symbols of the devastation in the war to local residents. It wasn't just the Belgians that were trying to help. Dozens of communities throughout the city pulled together to help their countrymen back home, such as the Scotch Canadians, the Italians, and Romanians. In addition, Detroit-born citizens were active in relief campaigns for wounded soldiers and French war orphans. Members of Detroit's Greek, Syrian, and Armenian communities were extremely active with the American Committee for the Relief in the Near East. The organization is credited with saving approximately 1 million lives during the humanitarian crisis caused by the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. It provided food, medical care, and established centers to care for children orphaned during the Armenian genocide, and most of the money raised in the community was done through personal campaigns, bazaars, and other social undertakings. And of course, some men wanted to participate in a more direct kind of action. Although exact numbers aren't available, it's known that large numbers of Detroit-born men traveled to Canada to enlist in the armed forces. Commonly, Detroit men found themselves with the 241st Essex, the 99th, and the Kent Scottish. Men risked more than their lives when enlisting the Canadian forces. It was illegal for American citizens to fight in a foreign army, and they could be stripped of their citizenship when they returned from war. But of course, the group affected most by the war was the German community. Detroit's Germans were a well-established community of professionals, teachers, musicians, and laborers. They've been around since the 1850s. During the early war years, Germans' community was viewed as well-assimilated, good citizens. Everything changed in June of 1915 when a series of bombs rocked southern Ontario, targeting buildings related to the Allied war effort. The ringleader of the plot was Albert Kaltschmidt, a German native living in Detroit. The trial was sensational and involved everyone from his neighbors on up to the German ambassador to the United States. The Kaltschmidt case proved to many that some fears of disloyalty within the Detroit's German community were not entirely unfounded. Immediately following this, many Germans set aside cultural traditions and stopped speaking German in public in an attempt to blend in or Americanized. But of course, by that point, it was already too late. The war starts on April 6, 1917, and immediately all Germans are declared enemy aliens. This means that all men who were over the age of 14, including U.S. citizens who were born in Germany, had to register with the post office, carry registration papers, submit to interrogation, and would be arrested and sent to a detention facility for failure to comply. The next year, they did the same thing with the German-born women. Detroit had the largest population of Germans in the state. We had 6,500 men and 4,000 women who were registered. We also had a number that did go to jail because they didn't register. According to the newspapers, it seemed a lot of the times it was a misunderstanding. They didn't understand that they had to register, but people weren't taking any chances. So when the war came, President Wilson was faced with a decision of how he was going to get his military ready. He was against the draft at first and hoped to get an army of 1 million men through volunteers. It became apparent almost immediately that this wasn't going to work. Only 72,000 men enlisted in the first 6 weeks. On May 17, 1917, much to many surprise, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. This draft was different than the drafts in the past because it required all men to serve regardless of social station or economic background. If you might recall, wealthier men back in the Civil War were able to buy somebody to stand in their place. But Wilson was very against this. He thought that everybody had to serve their country equally. There were 3 different drafts total during the war, with another scheduled but canceled because of the armistice. The first happened on June 5th, 1917, and it took all men between ages 21 and 31. June 5th, 1918, took all the men who turned 21 between the drafts. There was a similar situation that happened in August of that same year that went for everybody who was 21 between June and August. So as you can see, they were getting desperate for more men. Finally, by September 12, 1918, they were taking all men between the ages of 18 and 45. Now, I mentioned there was a 4th draft, and if I recall correctly, it was going to happen in November, right after when the armistice actually happened, and they were going to take men, it was either 50 or 55, which if you think about the life expectancy at that point, you're pretty much taking everyone. To be certified for selective service, you had to be between 5 feet and 6 feet 8 of a proportional weight, have good hearing and vision, and have your chest measured because they believed you could find tuberculosis like that. There are a number of reasons how you could try for an exemption or a deferral. There are things called temporary exemptions and deferrals, which may kind of stay off the draft for a little bit, but would cause you to get called up later. That's if you have a dependent spouse and a young child. Also, if you're working in like the war industry or an agricultural worker, these are called necessary industries. There are exemptions and deferrals for people who are ineligible for service. That is the clergy, federal and state officials, and people who were medically disabled, morally unfit, and enemy and resident aliens. Don't ask about morally unfit, I don't know. Of course, the resident aliens were allowed to waive their exemptions after a short time, in due part because of what happened in Detroit. A quota system was put in place to determine the amount of men that each city had to send. Detroit's quota for the first draft was 22,000. Detroit was at a disadvantage because it was an industrial city and had a disappropriate amount of draft-aged men than your average city. Roughly 1/3 of the men registered in the draft were non-citizens and therefore not subject to draft. Because of this, roughly 10% of the eligible American men in Detroit were called at once. Situations like Detroit's caused the rules to be amended so that resident aliens could serve if they wished, and in many cases, the men who volunteered would be granted citizenship upon their return from service. 154,770 men were registered in Detroit during this first draft. The booths opened at 7 a.m. and stayed open until the last man was through. In some districts, this was after 3 a.m. Going was slow due to the fact that there were many men who didn't speak English, and in these cases, a call would go out to the line to find someone who could translate. The gentleman you see at the center here is a bit of an anomaly. There was a separate registration held a couple days before at City Hall for the 99 eligible, or supposedly eligible Chinese residents of the city because they needed help figuring out when they're actually born because they used a different calendar. So they had to make special accommodations for that. Men who refused to register for the draft for philosophical, political, or simply reasons of self-preservation were arrested and went to local jails, sometimes for years. The draft lottery was called on July 20th, 1917, to pick out what they called the selects. Most of the men found out by reading the draft list on the paper. And that was kind of the interesting thing about, at the time, you're finding a lot of your information out through the paper. Like you find out if you were called up for the draft. In the case of the deferrals, you would also find out if you'd received your deferral. But with that, they would print your name and address and why you got the deferral, because they were telling you you got it, but they're also telling your neighbors that you applied for it. So it was kind of a shaming technique. Enlisted men started leaving the city in August 1917. Among the first to go were 319 Detroit men, mostly members of prominent families of son or military men, who were selected to train at the Fort Sheridan Officers Reserve Training Camp. The city was extremely proud that they had such a high number selected. the program, and it was the talk of the papers for the weeks surrounding it. But the first group of a more significant size to be called out was the 31st Infantry, a local National Guard unit that had just returned from service along the Mexican border. On August 5th, 1917, the entire U.S. National Guard was drafted. The next week, 1,700 men from the 31st who'd been staying at Fort Wayne left the city for Camp Grayling. A parade like this would become a common sight from the city as she welcomes or bids goodbye men leaving or coming to war. The men selected for service through the draft lottery started leaving in small groups of 150 to 190 a day during the week of September 7th. More men could not be moved sooner because Camp Custer, their destination, wasn't ready for them. In fact, it was almost entirely still under construction. Nevertheless, Detroit had a quota of 22,000 men it needed to fulfill. A massive draft parade was designed for September 18th. From this, 10,000 men would entrain for Camp Custer. As you might imagine, it was an absolute mob scene. An estimated crowd of 500,000 swamped the streets, Woodward to Jefferson, to see the men off, crammed into every available space imaginable. The best views were gotten by the climbers, the hundred of people who climbed on top of trees, public artwork, or followed from rooftops and windows. You can see them in the upper right corner underneath the Blackstone sign and on the Soldier and Sailor Monument. There was great concern that the Detroit's community of anarchists, socialists, pacifists, enemy aliens, and Irish, because remember the Irish were in the middle of a civil war with the English, might try and cause mayhem. But as it turned out, flustered pacifists were the least of the problems for the DPD. Hundreds of officers were soon overcome by the crowds and struggled to clear a way for the 25,000 marchers. The papers described it as a mass of simultaneous cheering, fighting, fainting, and crying. Over 50 people were recorded at receiving hospital, many with serious injuries. The youngest victim was a little girl who was cut when an overburdened balcony collapsed near her. But the parade itself, once it got going, was magnificent. Members of the Canadian military, dozens of bands from around town, Shriners, Boy Scouts, veterans of foreign wars, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Elk Club, Polish Falcons, and local entertainers were all featured. And of course, the highlight was the drafted men who strode through the crowd, singing and shouting on their way to the train station. In the following week, several thousand more men would leave, but in smaller groupings. Most of the men who enlisted or were drafted into service left the city through one of its train depots, either through the newly built Michigan Central Station or Union Depot down on 3rd. The stations quickly became the city's lifeline to the war, carrying out a constant supply of troops, volunteers, and supplies in and out. For the men leaving from Michigan Central, more often than not, they would gather at Navin Field, which is also, of course, Tiger Stadium, because it was a large open area and its proximity to the train station and to public transportation. Once all the men were accounted for, they would parade, often accompanied by a band and a Boy Scout or two, from Navin Field through the surrounding neighborhood. It almost never failed that several hundred people would turn out to see them off. Family members often skipped these impromptu parades to secure a good spot at the station gates for the possibility of one last goodbye. In the beginning, family members were allowed inside the station, often right on the platform, but the practice had to stop for security reasons. Detroit men served in many different units throughout the military. However, those listed above have been noted to have large amounts of Detroit men, in particular the 339th Infantry, the 329th and 330th Field Artillery. They were made up of almost entirely Detroit men. The 125th and 126th Infantry were made up from the 31st, 32nd, and 33rd Infantry of the Michigan National Guard, also local boys. In addition to sending fighting units, Detroit also sent over its medical specialists. The sheer volume of casualties on the Western Front made the mobilizations of these medical units a priority. The enlisted staff of Harper Hospital mobilized almost immediately after the U.S. declaration of war. Unfortunately, their enthusiasm and efficiency couldn't overcome supply shortages. The unit wouldn't make it to France until summer. Once in France, they were stationed in Dijon and made their home in a series of disused hotels and residential buildings. Seen here are the Harper Hospital nurses en route to France as they take some fresh air and pose for a snapshot aboard the SS Mongolia. The ship launched on the auspicious day of Friday the 13th and was chased by a submarine through the danger zone just off the North American coast. They made it to France okay. The interesting thing about the nurses with these hospitals is that they weren't enlisted in the Army. They were actually signed in through the American Red Cross. So they were no longer employees. Harper wasn't the only hospital to mobilize. The 36th Faith Hospital was organized out of the Detroit College of Medicine on April 11th, 1917. It consisted of 24 officers, 100 nurses, all organized under the auspices of the Red Cross, and 200 enlisted men. The men drilled 2 to 3 nights a week, mostly at Eastern Market or on Belle Isle. The unit mobilized on August 22nd and camped at the state fairgrounds for several months before being called to war. And that's where this picture was taken, at the fairgrounds. In the fall of 1917, the unit was sent to France, and it was the first hospital unit of over 1,000 beds to be deployed overseas. Of course, not everybody was drafted. Of the 4.8 million who served during the war, 2 million were volunteers. Detroit recruits for the first year numbered 22,720, slightly outpacing the number for drafted men. Patriotism drew many, as well as the desire to take charge of their destiny by choosing which branch of the military they wanted to serve, and the chance to enlist with neighbors and friends so they had a better chance of not going through training and service alone. The Navy was a popular choice with young men for whom the lure of open water seemed preferential to trench life in France. The Navy also brought in the heavy hitters to bolster its recruitment campaign. An example of this happened in May of 1918 when former President Teddy Roosevelt visited the city at the request of Ensign Coleman, head of naval recruitment in Detroit. The popular president drew huge crowds and bolstered the spirits of local enlisted men, like the members of the River Patrol seen here. The Navy also had a frequent visitor, the conductor John Philip Sousa. Sousa was a regular at recruitment drives in the city throughout the war years. Typically, he was accompanied by his 300-piece Great Lakes Naval Training Station band. The Army and Navy also often used craft that were used in famous battles as recruiting tools. The above ship, submarine chaser 173, was brought in during Navy Recruitment Week in November of 1917. She was a small part of larger festivities that include visiting guests, bazaars, balls, bands, and parades. Produced in Ohio and yet to see battle, the wooden ship was nonetheless a huge hit with the crowds, particularly because she was such a pretty ship, and partially because 3 of her crewmen were Detroit boys. Restaging of military battles were a popular way to recruit new troops and raise funds to support the war effort. In August of 1918, a restaging of the famed Battle of Vimy Ridge was performed at the state fairgrounds. 2,000 members of the 551st Brigade of the Michigan State Troops performed with airplanes on loan from Selfridge Field, tanks furnished from the Rouge plant, and live mortars, mines, and field artillery. The highlight came at dusk when a canvas Mimic City, complete with its own twin-tower cathedral, burst into flame and crumbled to ruin. The showcase, witnessed by 15,000 odd spectators, was orchestrated through the help of Major J.F. Templeton, a Canadian Expeditionary Forces veteran of Vimy Ridge, who provided the men with an exact copy of the military orders from the battle. The proceeds raised went to repair the armory and to provide heavy winter coats to the National Guardsmen. Another popular way to get people interested in the military was to cover the exploits of some of our local sports heroes who had enlisted. In the beginning, Detroit Tiger and baseball legend Ty Cobb was probably the press favorite. He'd registered for the draft but was placed on a wait list because of his age. Not to be deterred, he famously applied for inclusion in the Chemical Warfare Service while in Washington to play a game against the Senators. He was commissioned as a captain in the Army and headed overseas in October of 1918. Though he never saw a battle, his position was a dangerous one. During a training exercise in France, he and his men were exposed to poison gas. Cobb suffered mild lung damage, however, some of the men in his unit died from the exposure. Detroit race car driver Eddie Rickenbacker started the war as General Pershing's personal chauffeur and ended it as the world-famous flying ace. Rickenbacker was fascinated by planes and was certain his training as a racer would translate well to the skies. After leaving Pershing and working as an engineer officer, Rickenbacker convinced his superiors to let him join the 94th Aerial Squadron. Between April 29th and October 30th, 1918, he shot down 26 enemy planes, setting the American record for the war. The flying ace ended the war as a captain and the commander of his squadron. Now, it wasn't just the U.S. who was actively recruiting during the war years. Detroit was a popular city with foreign recruiters because of its large, relatively new immigrant population. American citizens may not have been allowed to join external armies. However, anyone who was a resident alien was free to do so without penalty. One of the largest campaigns was run by the British and Canadians, who both had a heavy population in the city. Of course, they weren't the only ones. The Serbian, Belgian, Italian, and Greek armies also recruited thousands of men out of Detroit. The largest contribution to a foreign army came from the Polish community, who sent over 3,000 men to the Polish army, which was stationed in France. So now that we've gone through all the people who are getting ready to fight, I thought we could run through what life was like in some of the camps that the Detroit men trained in. Most of the focus here is going to be on Camp Custer, because it was used by the most men and because I have so many cool photos of it. So Camp Custer is literally a city that was raised from cornfields in just about 5 months. 5 months seems like a brief part of time, but it's actually supposed to be built quicker. Fluid construction plans, a shortage of skilled construction workers, and bad weather played a large role in the delay of its completion. Troops trained in the unfinished camp for several months before it was formally handed over to the government. Delays or not, Custer was an impressive community, complete with hundreds of buildings featuring steam heat, lights, water, and sewers, the ability to house 40,000 men at once. By the end of the war, over 100,000 men had passed through the camp. The officers at Custer had their work cut out for them. Unlike the National Guardsmen, who were already familiar with the military and had been through training prior to the war, these new recruits would have taken much longer to get into fighting form. Many would not leave the camp until well into 1918. The men were from every type of occupational background, from breaker to musician to industrial worker, and were not necessarily inclined to military life. And it wasn't just the camp that was unfinished when the first troops arrived. Uniforms couldn't be made quick enough, and many men drilled in street clothes for the first few weeks. Weapons were also late in coming. Many had to use wooden bayonets when training, and the artillery had to use wooden forms to learn how to assemble and deassemble field artillery. The men didn't seem to mind, though, and they lovingly called these forms the pride of the 320th. You know, World War I is usually called the first modern war because it embraced so many new mechanized technologies in its battles, such as the use of aircraft, tank, chemical warfare, and motor vehicles. Once the weapons arrived, Camp Custer enlisted the help of experienced European officers to help train the men. The Europeans were used to demonstrate the correct use of the weapons and to give insight into successful training techniques with all these new types of things that the Americans were not familiar with. Few exercises were as dreaded as anti-gas training. At Camp Custer, Lieutenant N.F. Nevis was in charge of training the men to sense gas and get their equipment on and adjusted within 6 seconds. To do this, they were exposed to a small amount of lacrimose gas in a gas house without a mask. Then they would be exposed with a mask to gas in a long trench. The unfortunates who failed the trench test by not recognizing gas or getting their masks on in time were used as practice patients by the medical staff. Above, we see the men make their way through the long trench. To prepare themselves for combat, the men trained extensively in trenches that they dug out by hand and fortified. These were not your average trenches. There were 2 complete trench systems built side by side that created a half-mile-long front used for training exercises. The trenches featured 2 complete sets of fire trenches, support, reserve, and communication trenches, machine gun encampments, warrens of dugouts, climbing posts, and listening posts. A barbed wire no man's land separated the 2 systems. In the image above, we see members of the 160th Artillery Brigade work on gun pit construction. Of course, training wasn't just learn how to use and maintain advanced technology. Much of it involved the traditional methods that would have been a constant in the military for years, such as physical conditioning. The men trained extensively with weapons, and they learned how to aim accurately and fire jams and machine guns and how to shoot and care for a rifle. But it was the bayonet instruction that many men had difficulty with because it involved the idea of combat at close range. The men practiced thrusting movements for half-hour blocks at a time until they learned how to hit all the major organs and how to effectively clear their weapons from their stick bundle victims. The men were also given practice in learning how to read maps, use field radios, and do basic things like setting up field kitchens and campsites and washing clothes. Extra classes were held to give men skills that would be useful once overseas. Officers were expected to become proficient in French so that they could communicate with their French colleagues. Unfortunately for the men above, they would never get a chance to practice their craft as they were sent to Russia instead of France. Naturally, there were a number of men who didn't speak English at all, either because they were recent immigrants who volunteered or because they were natural-born citizens who lived in areas where you could get by without English. The YMCA ran classes for these men in the camps throughout the colony and throughout the country, and Camp Custer was one of the first Army camps to teach foreign-born students English in what they called the dramatic method. This is a way of teaching that illustrates every idea by action. The method, coincidentally, was established in the industrial night schools of Detroit. The men weren't learning Shakespeare, but rather basic commands and words that would prove useful to them in the field. Once the soldier proved conversant, he was given a course in civics in an effort to Americanize them further. Camp life could be a lonely experience for men who'd never traveled from home before. Men were kept busy in their off hours through donations sent to the camps by the American Library Association. The ALA held huge book and magazine drives throughout the war and sent reading materials to men in camps or men preparing to travel overseas. The Detroit chapter worked out of the Detroit Public Library and sent enough material to stock a full library and a library within the hospital. There were many opportunities for recreation besides the library at Camp Custer. Those soldiers had their own baseball teams, a theater, they could say plays, a social hall, which you see right here, and their own camp band, the majority of whom were musicians drafted out of service in Detroit. But of course, not everyone could use the facilities. Camp Custer, like most Army camps, was segregated. Custer had 2,000 African American soldiers throughout the war. From the very start, segregation proved to be a problem for the camp planners. When the first two showed up in camp in November of 1917, their barracks weren't ready yet, so they had to sleep in tents on the edge of town. For the most part, these men were sent in camp separate from their white counterparts and had separate sleeping areas and classrooms, most of which were overcrowded. A separate social hall was fabricated for the men in a disused factory by the War Camp Community Service, a group we'll talk a little bit more about later. Most of these men would not be given the opportunity to serve overseas. Rather, they would stay home and perform like labor and menial tasks. The other large Michigan camp that Detroit men were sent to was Camp Grayling in northern Michigan. It was used as a training camp by the Michigan National Guard, but at the time, outside of a newly built administration house, an officers' club, a hospital, and 40 mess houses, one for each expected unit in the brigade, it was largely a tent city. When the first men arrived at Camp Grayling in August 1917, they had to assemble the living area of the camp from materials shipped in with them. Grayling welcomed 5,000 soldiers in its first week active during the war, mostly men from the 31st and 32nd. Though definitely more rustic than Camp Custer, the men at Camp Grayling made the most of their environment, holding outdoor classrooms as weather permitted and training in varied, rugged environments. But of course, the open-air training of Camp Grayling was not suited to Michigan winters. Thus, the men of the 32nd Infantry, seen above, were sent to southern training grounds at Camp MacArthur, just outside of Waco, Texas. They were eventually joined by their fellow Michigan Guardsmen, the 31st and 33rd, along with National Guard troops from Wisconsin. The group would form the 32nd Infantry Division. The division arrived in France in February and quickly earned their nickname, the Red Arrows, for their fierce fighting style and ability to cut through lines like an arrow. Back in Detroit, Fort Wayne was humming with activity. It served as an induction center for Michigan troops and as an acquisition center for military motor vehicles and parts manufactured in the city for the war effort. In addition, the fort housed troops who were stationed in the city to protect the U.S. border, as well as guard against espionage in places like the underground rail tunnel that linked the U.S. to Canada. As far as the Navy goes, and I apologize, I don't have very many pictures for where they went, most of our men were sent to the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, just north of Chicago in Illinois. The center was the largest naval training station in the United States and trained over 100,000 men during the course of the war. And if you can't tell what that is, those are all little soldiers that are making the American flag. It was a very popular thing they did at the time. They did it at Camp Custer too. Some of the naval recruits and reservists did stay local and trained at the River Rouge Naval Training Station, located close to the Fort Rouge plant. The Rouge Station helped supply men to patrol the waters nearby the city, protecting them from possible enemy incursion. Since, as far as we know, U-boats never made it this far inland, the men spent most of their days sailing, drilling, and helping boaters in distress. The boats used were a mixture of military and requisitioned civilian craft. In addition to boats, cars, and the occasional animal, buildings were sometimes drafted into service as well. Henry Ford gave his not yet complete hospital over to the Army in 1917. The hospital would be known as U.S. General Hospital Number 36 for the duration of the conflict. It provided much needed medical service and therapy for approximately 2,000 wounded veterans as they returned home from overseas, and would play an important role in the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. And then, of course, there is Selfridge. The government was keen on making Detroit a center of aeronautics during the war, so it only made sense that an aviation training base would be established in the area. Work began on Selfridge Field in June of 1917, and it took 1,600 to 2,000 men, 6 weeks to level former marshlands and construct over 50 buildings. It was named for Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, the first U.S. aviator to die in an air accident. Occupancy was established in August 1917 with room to train 900 aviators. The aviators were very expensive to train, an estimated cost of $75,000 each, due to the fact that they were likely to damage 1 or 2 planes during their training. Seen here is a composite print of the construction of Selfridge and the men responsible for it: Harry Hutton, Ray D. Chapin, Eugene Lewis, Howard E. Coffin, and Henry B. Joy. Selfridge had a number of different schools that trained men in specific areas of aviation. Besides training flyers, it had a school that trained airplane and gasoline engine mechanics, as well as an aerial gunnery school. The aerial gunnery school was lauded by the War Department as one of the best schools of its kind in the United States or abroad. The training grounds included 8 miles of targets over Lake St. Clair and the surrounding land. Seen above, machine gun gunners practice shooting at targets that are attached to buoys on Lake St. Clair. When it came to the war, the home front proved nearly as important to the Western Front and the fight against the Central Powers. Civilians sacrificed and raised the funds that funded the war effort, powered the war industry with their bodies, conserved food for the military and war relief, and volunteered with charitable organizations and campaigns. At a time when Detroit was struggling to find its identity, the war mobilized the different elements of the city, social, ethnic, and economic, under one common cause. So I thought we could start out in the area of civilian life that the city is most known for, and that's the war industry. Detroit was perfectly poised at the beginning of the war to become a major industrial player. It was a natural fit with the recent industrial revolution going on. The city was filled with brilliant engineers, highly capable workers, and the necessary physical infrastructure already in place. So we're going to have a look at some of the more interesting things that Detroit produced during the war. And we'll start off with the Ford Motor Company. Though seemingly every car company was involved in producing materials for the war, it was Ford that really dominated the scene in terms of sheer output and the variety of materials being built. The factories crafted Liberty engines, Petite M1918 tanks, steel helmets, submarine detectors, and lightweight plank for tanks. In addition, it made 6,000 ambulances with 33,000 cars. The Model T remained one of the most sought-after vehicles in the First World War due to its versatility. The chassis was used as a basis for Allied forces' cargo ships, truck transports, ambulances, and modern mobile command centers. One of Ford's most famous products to come out of the war was the 200-foot steel ships known as Eagle boats. Early in the war, Joseph Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, approached Henry Ford to talk to him about the possibility of mass production of submarine chasers. Ford agreed to do so in January 1918, Work began on the ships at the newly erected Building B at the Ford Rouge plant. Production was much slower than expected, and only 7 of the 100 ordered by the War Department were completed on schedule. None of them made it to Europe by the armistice. What nearly makes up for the failure of the Eagle boat is the development of the Fordson tractor. German blockades and horrific attrition rate of men and horses during the war had left Britain desperate to find a way to increase its food production. The Fordson tractor, produced at the Ford plant in Michigan and Brady, quickly became the hero of British farmers. Ford delivered hundreds of the machines to Europe, where they were used to raise crops to support the war effort. Of course, Ford wasn't the only one building ships. Detroit had a long legacy of shipbuilding that stretched back into the 19th century. The Great Lakes Shipping Company and Amship Detroit, formerly known as the Detroit Shipbuilding Company, were producers of cargo ships and transport vessels throughout the war. Above, we have the view of festivities that occurred when the Great Lakes Shipping Company lost 3 new cargo ships, Lake Janet, Lake Pearl, and Lake Silver, on July 4th, 1918. 15,000 people showed up for an employee planned gala, which you see here. You can see all the people in the front there. They're actually on roofs. What's kind of significant about this party that they planned was all of the speakers and all the parades and everything they had, they were the people who actually built the boats. Usually they would bring in important dignitaries to have words, but it was very emotional because it was the men who had kind of put their blood, sweat, and tears into it. Artillery tractors, which could haul supplies over uneven terrain, quickly replaced horses as a transportation method of choice. Maxwell Motors made 2,193 of the 5-ton armored vehicles during the war, several of which are parked in a residential neighborhood on the east side. Although Detroit was seemingly producing everything under the sun, it was Liberty engines that caught the attention of America. The engines were designed to be mass-produced with interchangeable parts and soon became the standard in wartime aircraft engines. Contracts for Liberty aircraft productions were given to 5 automobile companies by the Aircraft Production Board: Lincoln Motor Company, Packard Motor Company, Ford Motor Company, Nordyke and Marmon, and the Buick and Cadillac divisions of General Motors all received. Lincoln Motor Company was the youngest of the companies to be selected to make the engines. The company was founded in 1917 by the engineer Henry Leland and his son Wilfred C. Leland. The new factory, which was designed by Detroit architect George D. Mason, was built within 5 months in a site located at Warren and Livernois. Besides manufacturing Liberty engines, Lincoln Motors also ran a robust munitions program. Over 600 women were employed in the making of munitions, many of whom were war widows or had husbands in the service. Lincoln was the first war plant in the nation to engage women with oxyacetylene welding, a process in which the flame burns at 6,330 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit, and is demonstrated in the image above. Detroit factories are not only producing vehicles, a large number of them were heavily involved in creating munitions. Maxwell Motors was one of the larger producers in the city and excelled at making 75 millimeter shells at its newly retooled Oakland Avenue plant. The city was a major producer of aircraft during the war. One of the more advanced manufacturing outfits was the Fisher Body Corporation's airplane division. Between July 19, 1917 and December 24, 1918, the factory employed 4,500 workers and produced 400 JN-1 training planes, 1,600 de Havilland planes, 4 battle planes, and 5 Caproni bombers. Unlike some other factories who only make a specific part of a craft, Fisher Body was involved in every aspect of airplane building. From top to tail, most pieces of the plane were crafted by hand, as demonstrated here as women sew canvas to wings. And here, as men stain wooden propellers. I just add these because they're really pretty. I love these pictures. At the peak, the plant turned out an average of 40 planes a day. Of course, Fisher wasn't the only one to make airplanes on site. During the war years, Packard's sprawling complex on East Grand Boulevard was one of the largest auto manufacturing plants in the United States. Packard turned to war work sooner than many other automobile companies and used its extra space to manufacture Liberty V8 and V12 aerial engines, as well as airplanes and other military transport. Many of the workers that you see in these photos were presumably fairly new to the profession, and that's because a large number of industrial workers at the time were actually replacement workers for men who had been drafted. Early in the war, it became apparent that there was going to be need for formalized training for these new hires. So programs were set up throughout the city to help ensure that these workers, who were mostly women and high school students, were both up to speed with their particular process and well-versed in safety procedures. You may have noticed by now how a lot of these photos feature someone rather unexpected for the time period, namely large amounts of women working in an industrial setting. When we think of women war workers, we usually think of World War II's Rosies. However, the original Rosies got their start 25 years prior. Most companies were resistant to using women workers in the beginning, but soon changed their mind once chronic labor shortages caused by the draft threatened production numbers. The factories in Detroit were always looking for more men. They never had enough, and so they were usually behind in their production. By May 1918, women were brought into war plants in relatively high numbers to perform jobs that didn't require brute strength and quickly gained a reputation for excelling at detail work. Chalmers Motor Company was one of the first to employ women in a variety of positions, including working on a drill, bench and milling machines, assembly and inspection of work, and work in the foundry. The atmosphere was pleasant enough for a factory, and the ladies were given special restrooms where they could have comfortable chairs, Victrolas, and popular magazines that were available during their breaks. The war industry was not the only place where women were employed in non-traditional roles. Detroit's women replaced clerks and postal workers, worked as special police detectives, They worked in transportation industry, driving taxis and streetcars, manning railway crossings and towers, and served as conductorettes on the Woodward Avenue line of the Detroit Urban Railway. During the war, everyone was expected to participate in supporting the war effort, be it through physical labor, volunteerism, or by supporting fundraising efforts by the government or charitable organizations. The largest of these campaigns naturally was the Liberty Loan Drive. Liberty bonds were one of the most successful fundraising tools in the First World War, bringing in a total of $18 billion. Each city was assigned a subscription target based on their population. The citizens and businesses of Detroit were enthusiastic supporters of the bond program and consistently surpassed their assigned quotas of subscriptions. So what you see up there are the different bond drives that they had and how much that Detroit brought in. And on average, they were at least $2 million over. War plants were popular places to recruit for Liberty loans because the money raised during the Detroit drives would ultimately come back to the city in the form of government contracts. During the first year of the war, Detroit alone brought over $750 million in war contracts. Employees and owners were exceedingly generous, likely from an equal measure of self-preservation and patriotism. Dodge Motor Company and its employees pledged $1.5 million in Liberty loans during the first drive alone. Liberty loan time tended to be a highlight of wartime social season, if only because there was so much activity going on around town. Liberty loan rallies aimed to draw a maximum number of people out, typically doing so by tempting the populace with musical performances, parades, and guest speakers. Politicians of local and international standing, military officers and heroes, orators, and members of the community all came to speak, though it was the artists and entertainers who felt most at home in front of the large crowds. Above, we have Canadian actress Marie Dressler, star of vaudeville and the silent screen, as she engages the audience at a Liberty Loan drive. Children became so involved in the Liberty Loan staging of festivities that in 1918, the superintendent of Detroit Public Schools decided to start a class a week early, a precaution to make up for delayed schoolwork during the campaign. One of the mainstays of the loan was Detroit's Liberty Band. This was a 100-piece band that was made up of entirely of volunteer musicians. They played during Liberty Loan events, fundraisers, charities, and parades for the returning troops. The pressure to support Liberty Loan's campaign was intense, and yet $50 bonds were usually out of the reach for many. In an effort to reach a wider audience of patriots, the government created the War Savings Stamps. The stamps came in two varieties, a 25-cent thrift stamp and a $5 War Savings certificate. Bless you. Of course, there's little fun in just buying a stamp from a cart, so the War Stamp campaign got creative and enlisted the help of a well-known tank to help them sell stamps. On June 19, 1918, the city came out to see its first glimpse of the famed Britannia, the star of the Battle of Arras. Britannia was on tour of the United States in patriotic fundraising campaigns, and for only $10 in stamps, you got to ride in her tank. I think most buyers thought this was money very well spent indeed. The Britannia wasn't the only weapon to make a visit. Detroit was host to a captured U-boat and assorted artillery. She was also a frequent stop for visiting military celebrities, particularly for aviators. In 1918 July, Detroit was wild with excitement over a visit from the legendary Blue Devils, an elite regiment of mountain infantrymen from the French Army. The majority of the representatives from the unit were brought onto North American publicity tours so that they could recover from wounds while still serving the war effort. War bonds were not the only fundraiser going on at the time. In fact, it seemed like there were always several going on at once. One of the larger undertakings was the Detroit Patriotic Fund. The campaign aimed to raise $7 million in 7 days, with the money being used to support the war, and this happened in May of 1917. The week-long charity event accumulated in massive parades of 25,000 marchers from various Detroit charities. The Liberty Loans, the Patriotic Fund, are but a few of the numerous agencies that benefited from the generosity of Detroiters. By the end of the first year, Detroit had raised over $200 million through loans, donation, and taxes, an average of about $200 for each man, woman, and child in the city. That's $200 in 1918 dollars, a pretty spectacular figure considering that most people had very little to give at the time. One thing I noticed when I was doing research for my book was that there were countless parades going on at the city at any given moment. These were hugely popular social events that were sponsored by many different groups. Fundraising campaigns were probably the most common, but also parades for holidays, visiting guests, recruitment campaigns, departing or visiting soldiers, or for causes such as food conservation or supporting a particular population overseas. The Red Cross was huge in the parade scene, sponsoring smaller events and pairing with other organizations like the Detroit Department of Recreation. Outside of the armistice celebration and the draft parade, Detroit's largest parade held was for the Detroit Patriotic Fund in the May of 1918. An estimated audience of 200,000 was in attendance, and the parade was a marvel of color, design, and planning. Many of these floats and costumes were designed by Sam Hume of the Arts and Crafts Society. Seen here, Mrs. Frances Clark is the goddess atop the charity float. Of the many floats that sailed down Woodward Avenue during this parade, perhaps the most spectacular showing was the Spirit of the Red Cross float and its retinue, as seen above. The ship carried children of men serving overseas and featured the Sisters of Mercy, flanked by 2 Knights Templar. Outriders from the Grosse Pointe Riding and Hunt Club carried the colors, and hundreds of Red Cross volunteers marched behind the float. The theme that permeated the city during the war was one of extreme patriotism. Americanization classes, programs, and activities intended to familiarize immigrants with the language and cultural practices of the United States were heavily offered through local organizations as well as national groups like the YMCA. And it was in the same spirit of patriotism that drew people into volunteerism. One of the larger initiatives was food conservation. America didn't necessarily have mandatory rationing during First World War, but a general call went out for people to conserve items high in demand by the military: red meat, wheat flour, and sugar. Meatless Tuesdays were practiced in many Detroit homes as well as all hotels. And I don't know if you can tell what this is, but this is a little grocery store, and it's just covered in these patriotic food conservation posters. War gardens or victory gardens were popular ways for people to contribute to the food conservation effort by providing themselves with fresh produce. The gardens dotted parcels of land throughout the city and over 100 empty lots in public spaces, all of which was condoned by Mayor Marks. In addition to war gardens, canning was all the rage, and classes were given throughout the city to help people learn the craft. Of particular note, a conservation kitchen was set up at 146 Woodward, which gave demonstrations in wartime cookery using alternate meats and substitute flours. Classes there were constantly packed, and the lab was able to be self-sustaining due to the fact that they sold their bread to the public. For many, the cost of rather than conservation of food was of primary concern. Prices rose steadily during the war, and by the summer of 1918, Detroit ranked 10th in the nation for food prices. In response to public demand, a model victory garden was established on the front lawn of the downtown library at Gratiot and Farmer in June of 1918. The garden was used as an educational tool to help inform the public on best gardening practices and food conservation topics like canning and preserving. A library assistant was on hand every fine day at the stand in the garden to check out books and distribute seed catalogs and government pamphlets. Starting in 1918, the Detroit Public Schools took the patriotic theme to the rather extreme limits by canceling all German language classes in schools. The language classes were replaced with a course in patriotism. Even more popular than food conservation were the sewing and knitting programs. Patterns for socks, scarves, vests, and hats were made available and free to the public. Huge amounts of people participated: housewives, nurses, Red Cross units, school children, Boy Scouts, even the firefighters. Then completed knits were sent to the men in service. A similar project was set up for sewing. Scrap fabrics were turned into surgical dressings, hospital garments, pretty frocks for war orphans, and fur-lined vests for the aviators. The sewing and knitting clothing total for the first year in Detroit alone was over 2.2 million items. Individuals and small aid organizations, particularly those based in immigrant communities, played a large role in securing funds for war relief. An estimated $15 million was collected on behalf of servicemen and former countrymen in Europe and Asia Minor by these organizations, with significant representation from Detroit's Belgian, Jewish, Armenian, Russian, Serbian, Polish, Greek, Romanian, and Italian communities. These funds were raised through a series of bazaars, balls, theater performances, rallies, and individual appeals. Some communities gave non-monetary support by sending supplies to foreign troops or volunteers, like the 48 members of the Polish White Cross, who traveled from Detroit to Europe to help directly. Of all the various volunteer organizations that were around, though, the Detroit Red Cross was the grand lady. It had the broadest reach in its mission and the widest range of volunteers, both socially and economically. Though most leadership positions were filled by prominent women in society, the majority of the volunteers came from backgrounds that ran the social gamut. Poor women, middle-class women, immigrant women, and women of different faiths all play vital roles. Through different departments, the Detroit Red Cross volunteers served as nurses at home and abroad, assisted in the rebuilding of Europe at the conclusion of the war, made surgical dressings and bandages, made clothing for soldiers and war orphans, served as ambulance drivers and stretcher bearers for local hospitals, engaged in social work with veterans and their families, worked in food conservation, fed soldiers, and put in countless hours of fundraising. The nurses and nurses' assistants were particularly important to the local medical community that had lost so many to General Hospital number 36. While private fraternal organizations like what is it? Oh, I forgot their names now. The Red Cross, unlike other places, didn't necessarily have their own headquarters. Volunteer organizations typically had to make do with borrowed space from public or private buildings. Libraries, schools, and basements were the most common home to the Red Cross units. These units were often established by women of certain geographic areas or affiliation groups. The ones we see here, for example, are Daughters of the American Revolution. One of the more direct ways that the Red Cross volunteers helped with war efforts was through the Detroit Canteen. The canteen was located in the basement of Michigan Central in a rail car on the Wabash Yard. It cared for an average of 18,000 soldiers weekly. In addition, they also maintained a restaurant for soldiers and sailors at 22 Witherell Street and catered to men stationed locally. The canteen had 280 workers who prepared, served, and sometimes delivered food to men at the stations. By following train schedules, the women make sure that piles of oranges, donuts, sandwiches, spice cakes, and pies, and hot coffee were always ready for the men as they passed through. In addition to serving in the canteen, the women would also deliver food in packages through the train windows if the men hadn't time to detrain. They would also take on the mail of the departing soldiers and make sure that it got sent to the post office. The Red Cross aimed to recruit children into its fold as both a way to help young people invest in their community, but also as a way to reach possibly the children's parents. Members of the Junior Red Cross knit clothing, rolled bandages, tended war gardens, rehabilitated used materials, fundraised, sent letters to soldiers, and made friendship boxes for needy children overseas. Locally, Detroit had approximately 100,000 members. Above, members of the Junior Red Cross at Morley Elementary School celebrate reaching 100%, which means enrolling 100% of their students in the Junior Red Cross. They're celebrating with a parade through the neighborhood. The Boy Scouts of America were a relatively new organization when America entered the war, but they wasted no time getting involved. Scouts, typically working with the Junior Red Cross, knitted for soldiers, made toys for orphans, tended war gardens, and participated fundraising for charities. Notably, they played a vital role in the success of the War Stamps and Thrift Stamps campaign, going door to door soliciting commitments. The Scouts were in attendance at nearly every parade the city offered, whether it was to send off a few hundred soldiers or something far larger like the draft parade. On screen, we see an image presumably taken at a Red Cross parade, and they're burying Kaiser Bill. The National League of Women's Service was an organization that was created in 1917 in conjunction with the American Red Cross. It trained women to fill necessary jobs left vacant by enlisted men. Volunteers were primarily from the comfortable classes, as each woman needed to have her own vehicle, a luxury at the time. Activities initially included motor and driving repair, medical training, map reading, and telegraphy. As the war intensified, the scope quickly broadened to include the care and transport of wounded and convalescing soldiers. The women seen in the photo here were part of a group who trained in engine repair so they could drive ambulances at home and abroad. Over 50 Detroit NLWS volunteers would serve in France, transporting soldiers to base hospitals or hospital trains. The women who served in Detroit also played a major role in getting the city through the influenza epidemic. Because Detroit was a major Midwestern hub, there was a constant stream of enlisted men passing through on any given day. A number of different venues around town were designed specifically to cater to these visiting servicemen. In spring of 1918, the YMCA set up a Y Hut on Elizabeth Street. the first of its kind in the United States. Y huts were widely used throughout Europe as rest and recreation spaces for soldiers. This hut featured an auditorium that could be turned into a dormitory, a lounge, locker room, showers, office, and kitchen. All men from any branch of the military, from any country, were welcome. The War Camp Community Service was established to act as a clearinghouse for information pertinent to enlisted men and to organize recreational activities for soldiers and sailors in the area adjacent to military bases. In Detroit, the service hut was in the heart of it all at Campus Martius. Besides being an information hub, it also served as a recruiting station. One of the more popular recreation activities included dances and moonlight cruises on the Detroit River with local Red Cross volunteers. The group also ran an Army and Navy restaurant around the corner for visiting servicemen. Despite the nonstop festivities, 1918 was a difficult year for most. The casualty lists grew steadily, and the first of the remains of the men who were killed overseas were starting to come home. A coal shortage, coupled with one of the coldest winters on record, left many homes unable to heat themselves. Women and children took to the rail yards to pick up whatever could be found. The coal shortages forced many businesses to close down on certain days of the week, including churches and schools. Factories were excluded naturally. In February, a crime wave caused Mayor Marks to call in the Michigan State Troops to assist the overburdened Detroit Police Department in rounding up the criminal elements. Food shortages, long hours at work, and the cold weakened immune systems increased Detroiters' vulnerabilities and paved the way for the pandemic. Spanish flu had been ravaging Europe for a time before it made its way to the United States, likely through troop carriers. It arrived in Detroit through the Naval Training Station in the fall of 1918, and the disease spread quickly throughout the cities. Schools and public venues, theaters and churches were all closed. Now, the Spanish flu was kind of different than the flus that we're used to, because usually with flu, it affects the young and the old. Spanish flu was affecting younger people, so people who were like 20 to 40. This was particularly devastating in the armies, as you can imagine, and also at home, because it was just laying out everybody. Red Cross volunteers served as an auxiliary of the United States Public Health Service during the influenza epidemic. Working in shifts of 14 to 16 hours a day, the nurses, motor corps, canteen workers provided services impossible for the city to offer due to a lack of manpower. They nursed the sick, made home visits, transported victims to the hospital, and made and delivered food baskets for people trapped in their homes by quarantine. In addition to the Red Cross, Detroit public school teachers were sent out to make home visits to quarantine patients once the schools were shut down because of the epidemic. By November 20th, 1918, just about 6 weeks into it, 18,066 cases of influenza were reported, with 1,688 fatalities. But war ended right around the time that Spanish flu started winding down, and everybody was so very pleased about this. November 11th, 1918 was the day that we heard that the armistice happened. It happened at 11 a.m. French time. So of course the horns and church bells started before daybreak here, sounding the end of the war. Thousands of revelers rose quickly and descended on the area surrounding the Liberty Forum, where speeches were delivered in English, Italian, and Greek. A holiday was declared in the schools and factories, and shops were closed to allow the city to celebrate together. Seen here, the sun rises over early morning crowds at Campus Martius. The din raised by the crowd was terrific. Spontaneous groups permeated the day, and elated celebrants sounded horns, pots, and pans, musical instruments in the street. There were bonfires, music, and dancing in the street out in the neighborhoods, but eventually it seemed like most people found their way downtown for the main event, a massive parade that shut the city down. Soon after all this happened, they started getting ready to mobilize the men and bring them back home. But there were two major concerns with the armed forces. First, the stability of Europe, and second, the ability of men to be reabsorbed in civilian employment. The government didn't want to remove all the troops at once in Europe in case peacekeeping forces were needed. In addition, there was a concern that soldiers might need assistance reassimilating into society and finding work. Michigan men started trickling into the country beginning in December, although the Michigan majority units would not arrive until spring. The men would typically be mustered into civilian life at an eastern camp, usually in New York or New Jersey, and then sent home with a train ticket and a week's pay. During the same time, the French hospitals started transferring casualties in home en masse. The War Department sent men to hospitals within 300 miles of their nearest relatives, which for Detroit men meant General Hospital 36, which is Henry Ford Hospital, or the base hospital at Camp Custer. Once the men were released from Army hospitals, many joined local occupational therapy classes run by the Red Cross. Most of the classes were run out of Harper Hospital in Fort Wayne. The men participated in activities that would keep them busy, such as basket weaving and toy building, while they convalesced. In the case of the men who had lost or damaged limbs, the project helped them fine-tune their motor skills while working with only one arm or limited vision. Though troops were released slowly from service to prevent issues of unemployment, demobilization quickly flooded Detroit's job market with servicemen. In January, over 200 men were arriving back each day into the city. Many had to do temporary work in fields outside of their area of specialty until the market was able to adjust to the post-war conditions. There simply wasn't enough good job openings to fill, especially since the war production contracts were now complete. The majority of women employed as replacements for men in heavy industry and otherwise lost their jobs when the veterans returned to the workforce. Above, this is a view of a bread line in a Detroit neighborhood. The first large group to return back to the city were the 16th Engineers on May 12, 1919. The group were just in Detroit for a few hours, and so no large celebrations were planned. Led by Colonel Harry Burgess, they marched from Michigan Central Station down to Michigan Avenue to Woodward, and then back to Grand Circus Park before they finally looped back to the station, mostly so they could give friends and family members a chance to see them before they re-entrained to Camp Custer, where they were mustered into civilian life. Cheers erupted as the first company of the 119th Field Artillery swung out of Michigan Central Station upon their return home on May 12, 1919. The Guardsmen moved towards downtown, surrounded by thousands of well-wishers. Their destination was the Armory, where they would be reunited with family members for a few hours before they would re-entrain for Lansing for a celebration at the Capitol. The Michigan units of the Red Arrow Division included the 125th and the 126th Infantry and the 120th Machine Gun Battalion. The departure of the Red Arrows to the war, without ceremony or parade, had weighed heavily on the minds of many Detroiters. So when it was announced that the men would return home on May 18th, the city decided to give them a welcome party like the city had never seen before. The crowd at the gate of Michigan Central at dawn grew steadily to the day to top 50,000. The men didn't arrive all at once. The 2nd Battalion of the 125th was delayed and didn't come in until 3 a.m., where they were greeted by a merry crew of approximately 1,000 people who waited nearly 24 hours to give them a proper welcome home. The next day was declared a holiday, with all the school and government offices and businesses closed to celebrate Red Arrow Day. Red Arrow Day was filled with parades, ceremonies, and dancing. Each soldier was given a card and a key to the city. The card entitled the man to refreshments at stands throughout the city, free passage on the Belle Isle Ferry, and entry to any theater or Navern field. Let's see. The Red Arrow Division had gained its name from its service in France, where it was known for its particularly fierce fighting style. The division fought in 3 major offenses and met and defeated 23 German divisions, repulsed every counterattack, and captured over 2,100 prisoners. And the city had followed their exploits closely throughout the war, so they were very, very excited to see them home. The result of all those victories, though, was an extremely heavy casualty list. It suffered from 14,000 casualties and was 3rd overall in the number of battle deaths for any division in the Army. Of the G Company, entirely made of Detroit men, only 22 made it home. One of the more remarkable stories to come from Detroit units in the First World War was that of the American North Russian Expeditionary Forces, also known as ANREF. ANREF was a contingent of men, mostly from the 339th Infantry, a battalion of the 310th Engineer Regiment, the 337th Ambulance Company, and the 337th Field Hospital. The units were broken up from the 85th Division upon their arrival in Europe in September of 1918 and sent to Archangel to protect stockpiles of Allied weapons and fight against Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. The group renamed themselves the Polar Bears as a testament to horrific conditions that they endured through their 9-month assignment. The Polar Bears fought Bolsheviks throughout northern Russian wilderness through a brutally cold Arctic winter. Despite being weakened by disease, exposure, food shortages, and low morale, the Polar Bears managed many victories against enemy troops. In April 1919, orders arrived allowing them to withdraw. However, they were forced to stay in Russia until early June because they were locked in by sea ice. Seen here, members of the 339th on duty in Russia. Dubbed locally as Detroit's own because a large amount of Detroit men who served within it, the city took special pride in the Polar Bears. For months surrounding the armistice, the soldiers' families, along with local editorialists and politicians, lobbied ferociously for their return to America. When the men arrived in the city on July 3, 1919, families and friends seemingly infiltrated every corner of Michigan Central. A grand fete was planned in honor of the men the next day, on July 4th. The men arrived at Belle Isle via the Britannia and were greeted by Red Cross workers bearing scented garlands of flowers. The island was dressed for her best for the celebration. Anything that could be decorated was decked with ribbons, flowers, and flags. In the background of this image, one can see the exterior of the that's the wrong one. Anyways, there were concerts, dancing throughout the day, and other celebrations for the men before they got their medals. Not all of the Polar Bears came home in July of 1919. Members of the 339th who were killed in conflict or died from disease remained in Russia until 1929, when a recovery expedition headed by 5 former Polar Bears under the auspices of the Veterans of Foreign Wars and funded by federal government in the state of Michigan, brought back 86 of the 125 Americans. The group used service diaries to retrace the tracks of the unit through Russia and worked with local Russians to locate and exhume the graves. This emotional work was rewarded upon their arrival in Detroit in December of 1929, as thousands of citizens braved a blizzard to pay tribute to their return. The coffins were placed in public view at Whitechapel Cemetery in Troy, and then placed in a crypt. 56 of the soldiers were interned in a cemetery on Memorial Day, 1930, near a monument dedicated to their memory at Whitechapel. The missing Polar Bears were at last the last piece in Detroit's story to be resolved. For many, the war was finally over. The cost of the war for Detroit, we don't really have any accurate figures of what it cost us monetarily, but we do know that 70,000 men enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces out of Detroit. We also gave several thousand other residences who fought for foreign armies, and there were 485 deaths. There are countless others who sustained grievous wounds, both physical and mental, that would mark them for the rest of their life. There are a number of local memorials that were established to remember the fallen. There's a school that was established on the east side in tribute to Joseph William Guyton. That's in the lower right-hand corner. He was a machine gunner for the 126th Regiment of the 32nd Division. He was the first U.S. soldier to perish on German-held land. In 1926, the University of Detroit completed its beautiful memorial clock tower. The 175-foot tower serves as both a memorial to the 12 University of Detroit men who lost their lives and as a chimney for the powerhouse. And finally, there is a memorial tablet in Belle Isle that was placed near the Peace Carillon by the World War mothers of Detroit and Windsor in memory of their sons lost in the AEF and the CEF. The war changed many social norms regarding gender, with the greatest change being the opinion of the issue of women's suffrage. The role women played in the war effort as volunteers, nurses, and workers proved to many that women deserved a voice within the political realm. Suffrage passed handily in Michigan in November 1918, nearly 2 years before it went national, through in part by strong support from local military, industrial, and local political figures, and by the tireless work of these suffragettes. One of the lasting impacts that the war had on Detroit was that it persuaded a number of her immigrants to stay and permanently settle in the city. Many had come to America with the intention of making money in a lucrative factory job, saving their wages, then returning home with enough to start a better life. The economic devastation of Eastern Europe made this dream nearly impossible. The war also brought out a new group of people to the city, desperate to escape the economic a collapse in Europe, and who were able to get into the U.S. before the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924 severely curtailed immigration from Europe. The most well-known of these new Detroiters are the Maltese, who established their community in Corktown in the early 1920s. For Detroit, the war had a great effect in forming the community-minded spirit and identity that would continue to develop in the next few decades. For the rest of the world, the success of the war industry helped shape Detroit's reputation as an industrial powerhouse. In fact, it was considered by many to be a model industrial city. This reputation would help cement Detroit's position during the Second World War as the undisputed arsenal of democracy. And I apologize, that was so super long.